Natalie Nakase spoke on Caitlin Clark and the Indiana Fever situation. And obviously she has great respect for Caitlin Clark's game, but she's had Caitlin Clark's number since she's become the head coach of the Valkyries. They have had the Indiana Fever's number for the most part. I think a large part due to the fact that Caitlin Clark has an idiot and a bonehead as a head coach who's in the way. She keeps getting put on these minutes restrictions. She's being sabotaged left and right.
Sometimes the biggest mismatch in basketball has nothing to do with speed, size, or talent. Sometimes the real mismatch is standing on the sideline, holding a clipboard, watching everything unfold in real time. And that is exactly why this Caitlin Clark conversation keeps getting louder. Because every time Natalie Nakase's Valkyries line up across from Stephanie White's Fever, it feels like one coach is seeing the board before the pieces even move, while the other keeps getting dragged into the same exhausting debates. That's what makes this so uncomfortable for Indiana fans. This isn't just about one bad night. It isn't just about one awkward substitution or one post-game clip that caught fire online. It's about a pattern that keeps showing up, even when people try to wave it off as overreaction. Golden State looks sharp, connected, and fully committed to an identity. Indiana still looks like a team with elite talent trying to solve problems in public. And when the most watched player in the sport is at the center of that mess, every small issue starts to feel enormous. That's the part casual viewers miss. They see Caitlin Clark, they see the headlines, they see the numbers, and they assume the story begins and ends with the star. But this story is bigger than that. This is about what happens when one organization looks like it knows exactly what it wants to be, and another still feels like it's trying to figure that out on the fly.
And Natalie Nakase is taking full advantage of it. We have to get into what Natalie Nakase had to say before and after the game. Let's get into it. This is before. Actually, right here.
So it's getting there early, doing your work early, same thing, defend without fouling. And then Caitlin, it's obviously going to be a team effort. So yeah, just attention to detail in the game plan is going to be crucial tonight.
Guarding Caitlin Clark, there's no one person that can guard her. It's going to take the whole team. We need attention to detail. We got to be locked in on Caitlin Clark. That's the respect.
The Valkyries weren't supposed to be this polished this quickly. They were supposed to be an expansion team taking punches, building slowly, and maybe becoming dangerous a few years down the line. Instead, they turned into one of the smartest and most disciplined teams in the league almost immediately. They defend, they trust each other, they play hard for 40 minutes, and they don't look scared when a game gets messy. That doesn't happen by accident. That happens when the coach has everyone locked into a standard from the very beginning. Meanwhile, Indiana keeps living in this weird space where the talent says one thing, but the weekly conversation says another. The Fever have stars, they have scoring, they have national attention every single night. They have one of the most electric playmakers the game has ever seen. And yet somehow, every few days the story shifts back to questions about minutes, substitutions, chemistry, physical wear, sideline moments, or whether Clark is being put in the best position to dominate.
Now take a listen to Natalie Nakase explain how they ran circles around Bonehead White and the Indiana Fever.
Obviously, with this road trip of 5 wins, is there something like that you can take away from each of these games as like a connecting thread?
We're getting closer and closer together.
Before she even gets into there was a part in the game when Natalie Nakase told a player to do a certain thing and then they did it and it didn't work. And Natalie Nakase called timeout and she said, "My fault. My bad. That's my bad. That's not on you, player. That's on me, the coach."
That is why this whole Natalie Nakase versus Stephanie White discussion has exploded. Not because people love drama for the sake of drama, but because the contrast is impossible to ignore now. One coach took an expansion team and made it feel stable almost overnight. The other is trying to manage the loudest player environment in the sport, while fans keep wondering why things still look so unsettled. And once that question gets planted in people's minds, every game starts to feel like evidence. What makes this even more interesting is that Nakase didn't walk into some perfectly built machine. She didn't inherit a finished super team and just keep it running. She helped build Golden State's identity from the ground up, and now that identity is showing up in games that matter. That's why people are paying attention. That's why one clip from before the Fever game carried so much weight. And that's why this story isn't really about a single quote or a single loss.
We've never seen Stephanie White. We've never, ever seen Stephanie White be accountable like this lady. Ever.
Actually bond and become more closer, tighter knit. Because when you're on the road, you don't really have your own schedule, right? You don't have a car. So we do everything together. I had a ton of fun. I even said, hey, let's stay another night. They're all like, we gotta go home, coach. But no, I just enjoy spending so much time with every player, every staff member. That's what I feel like we're building. The record's the record, 8, whatever, but we're more, you know me. I'm focused on one game at a time, and what I feel is like, God, we're just getting more connected.
It's about what that loss revealed. Because the more these two teams face each other, the more it feels like Caitlin Clark isn't simply battling defenders. She's battling circumstance. And when one opposing coach clearly sees the danger she brings more cleanly than her own situation sometimes seems to, fans are always going to ask the obvious question. Is Clark being fully unlocked, or is she still trying to shine through a setup that hasn't quite figured itself out?
The players enjoy playing for her and with her. It's a completely different environment from the clown show that is Stephanie White's Indiana Fever.
So yeah, we knew Indiana was going to punch back the talent that they have on the team, and Stephanie White, just respect for her. She's a talented coach. She knows how to get her players. Did a hell of a job finishing, made her free throws at the end. Stayed really calm, cool, and collective, and they're hugging her so much, and so that's why Caitlin was able to do what Caitlin was able to do down the stretch.
Natalie Nakase's story matters here because it explains why players seem to trust her so fast. Long before she became one of the most respected young coaches in the WNBA, she was taking the long road through the basketball world. She could have chosen an easier path in college, but instead she walked on at UCLA, fought for minutes, became a 3-year starter, and eventually earned the role of captain. That tells you a lot about how she sees the game. Nothing came easy, so nothing gets taken lightly. Her own playing career was interrupted by knee injuries, which for a lot of people would have been the end of the story. For her, it became the start of another chapter. She stayed in the sport, kept learning, and moved into coaching without the kind of spotlight that usually surrounds future head coaches. There was no giant media campaign around her, no fast lane, no hype machine, just work. Then the journey got even more unusual. Nakase coached overseas in Germany and then in Japan, where she broke ground by becoming the first woman to serve as a head coach in that men's league. Think about that for a second. Before many fans in the United States even knew her name, she was already proving that players would buy into her leadership in spaces that don't usually make room for women in those roles. That kind of experience hardens a coach in a different way. It forces you to communicate clearly. It forces you to establish credibility quickly. It forces you to win respect without relying on title alone. And that matters now, because when you watch Golden State, you don't see a team following a resume. You see a team following a voice they believe in. After that came the NBA climb. Nakase joined the Clippers organization, beginning at the bottom and working her way through player development, video, and assistant roles. She learned under coaches who understood detail and preparation, then took that experience into the WNBA with the Las Vegas Aces. There, she was part of a championship environment and helped a loaded roster stay organized under pressure. That's a different challenge from building an expansion team, but it still matters. Winning around stars teaches you one thing, building from scratch teaches you another. Nakase got both experiences before she ever became a WNBA head coach. So when Golden State brought her in, they weren't hiring a feel-good story. They were hiring a coach who had seen elite systems from the inside and knew how to create standards. And still, people underestimated how quickly she could make it work. That's the funny part now. When the Valkyries launched, most people treated them like a future project. Give them time, let them learn the league. Maybe in a few years they'll be interesting. Nakase never talked like that. She talked about building culture immediately. She talked about competition, accountability, and habits. She made it clear that being new wasn't an excuse to be sloppy. And sure enough, year one changed everything. Golden State made history by becoming the first expansion team in WNBA history to reach the playoffs in its inaugural season. Nakase won Coach of the Year right away, not because the league wanted a nice story, but because the team was good enough that it couldn't be ignored. And instead of that success fading once the surprise wore off, the Valkyries came back in year two even more connected. That is when people stopped seeing the story as cute and started seeing it as serious. That background is why her pre-game comments about Caitlin Clark hit differently. Nakase didn't walk into that matchup pretending Clark was just another assignment. She said what a smart coach says when she knows she's facing a player who can hijack a game. She made it clear that stopping Clark would take the entire team. Not one defender, not one matchup trick, not one magic answer, The whole team, attention to detail, discipline, collective focus, that is real respect. And sometimes respect doesn't sound flattering. Sometimes it sounds like urgency. Sometimes it sounds like a coach warning everybody that if one player misses a rotation, loses vision for a split second, or cheats the wrong way in transition, Clark will punish the mistake before anyone can recover. That's why the quote stood out so much. It wasn't just coach speak, it was revealing. Nakase understands what Clark represents. She understands that Clark bends defenses even when the shot isn't falling. She understands that her range changes help rules, that her passing changes spacing, and that her confidence can flip momentum in a minute. She wasn't interested in acting relaxed about any of that. She treated Clark like the kind of problem that demands structure. And that's what high-level coaching looks like. It's not denying reality. It's seeing the danger clearly and organizing everybody around it. But that also creates a brutal comparison for Indiana. Because if the opposing coach is talking about Clark like she requires all-hands-on-deck urgency, then fans naturally start asking why Indiana's own environment sometimes feels so uncertain around her. That doesn't mean Stephanie White doesn't respect Clark. Of course she does. It doesn't mean White has no credentials either. She absolutely does. That's actually what makes the whole thing more jarring. This isn't a story about some unknown coach getting embarrassed because she has no track record. White has been respected in this league for a long time. She has won. She has been praised. She knows the game. And yet the Fever keep finding themselves trapped in the same kinds of debates, while Nakase keeps making an expansion team look cleaner and calmer than expected. That is what fans are reacting to. The difference is not just tactical. It feels philosophical. Golden State's messaging is simple. Compete hard, defend, trust each other, and stay accountable. Indiana's messaging may be just as clear inside the building, but from the outside it often doesn't look that way. From the outside, it looks like a team with massive upside that keeps becoming its own biggest talking point for reasons that have nothing to do with raw talent. And once viewers notice that, every quote and every decision starts carrying more weight than it normally would. That's exactly what happened with Clark's minutes restriction. A normal injury management story turned into a full-blown debate because the Fever no longer get the benefit of the doubt from a lot of fans. Too much noise has built up around too many decisions. So when Clark returned, the attention wasn't just on how she played. It was on whether the plan around her made any sense at all. That saga really took off when Clark came back from the back injury that had forced her to miss 2 games. On paper, the cautious approach sounded logical. Protect the star, ease her back in, don't ask too much too soon. Every coach in the world would say something similar. But basketball isn't played on paper, and Clark is not the kind of player who thrives in chopped-up rhythm. When she returned against Los Angeles and played only 16 minutes, fans immediately noticed how awkward the flow looked. She later admitted that the short bursts were hard. That was obvious even before she said it. 1 minute she was trying to settle in, the next minute she was sitting again. For a player who controls pace, reads coverages, and often needs a few possessions to really calibrate the game, that kind of stop-start management can make everything feel unnatural. Stephanie White defended the plan by saying that whenever a player misses time, it takes a while to get back into form. That is a fair explanation. It makes sense medically. It makes sense strategically if you're thinking long-term, but fans weren't hearing it in a vacuum. They were hearing it after weeks of already questioning the team's feel for rhythm, rotations, and momentum. So instead of the minutes limit calming people, it made many of them even more frustrated. The response online wasn't just about health. It was about feel. People were asking how Clark was supposed to get comfortable if she was being yanked in and out before she could read the game properly. And with a player this visible, once fans feel the coach is disrupting rhythm, that idea spreads fast. Then came the Las Vegas game, which only complicated the conversation instead of ending it. White said Clark would still be on a restriction, somewhere in that 20 to 25-minute range, but the staff would stop using those tiny 3-minute stints that had made the Sparks' return look so clunky. Indiana then went out and crushed the Aces by 34. Suddenly, the same people who had been yelling about the restrictions were split into different camps. Some said the adjusted rotation proved White had finally found a better way to handle it. Others said the game only highlighted how overmanaged the previous return had been. Clark herself made it clear she hoped she didn't have to keep playing just 25 minutes, which told viewers plenty. She felt better. She wanted more. She looked like a star trying to get fully back in rhythm, not someone content to be handled carefully forever. And then the Valkyries game dropped the whole thing back into controversy. Clark played 26 minutes against Golden State, which on the surface suggested the leash was loosening, but the actual game told a rougher story. She took a knee to the quad on a no-call that left her visibly upset. Afterward, she said the official couldn't miss something like that and pointed out that she had to play through a contusion in her leg for the rest of the night. Whether people agreed with her frustration or not, the bigger point was undeniable. She wasn't just fighting timing and conditioning anymore. She was fighting pain too. And Golden State, with a defense built on collective pressure and discipline, was exactly the wrong team to face under those circumstances. The numbers reflected that discomfort. Clark finished with 13 points on 4 of 14 shooting and just 1 of 8 from deep. Those aren't the numbers of a player fully in command of her environment. They're the numbers of a star trying to create through resistance from every angle. Physical resistance, defensive resistance, rhythm resistance. That's what made the post-game reaction so intense. Fans weren't just watching a player miss shots. They were watching a player who seems to carry a new layer of strain into every big moment right now. And because of everything that had already happened, the performance didn't get interpreted as a simple off night. It got folded into the bigger storyline. Another restriction debate. Another injury angle. Another game where the setup around Clark became part of the conversation. That's the real issue. None of these moments by themselves would be overwhelming. Injuries happen. Minutes limits happen. Frustration with officiating happens. But around the Fever, those moments don't stay isolated. They stack. They pile onto each other until the entire season starts to feel like one long argument about whether the team is helping its star enough or making the job harder than it has to be. That's what turns ordinary coaching choices into flashpoints. And against a team like Golden State, those cracks become more visible because the Valkyries are so clearly built to exploit hesitation. They don't need chaos to beat you, but if you bring any chaos into the game, they know exactly how to make it look worse. And that brings us to the actual matchup, because the scoreboard ended up confirming what the eye test had already been suggesting. Golden State beat Indiana 88-75, and the game felt like a lesson in how discipline can flatten talent when the execution gap is wide enough. The Valkyries started fast, won the tone early, and never really let the night settle into Indiana's comfort zone. The Fever did make a push and even grabbed a short-lived lead in the third quarter, which is what talented teams do. But that is also where the contrast showed up again. Golden State didn't panic. The Valkyries answered with a 17-4 run, re-established control, and pushed the game right back where they wanted it. That's not just players making shots. That's a team trusting the structure enough to withstand a swing without losing itself. The depth difference showed up too. Golden State got production from everywhere. 6 players scored in double figures. The bench tilted the game massively. The reserves outscored Indiana's bench by a huge margin, and that kind of support changes everything in a mid-season matchup. It lets the stars breathe, it keeps the pressure constant, it punishes every weak stretch. That is one of the quiet superpowers of a well-coached team. Role players don't look random, they look ready. When they enter the game, they already know the pace, the reads, the defensive responsibilities, and the emotional temperature. There's no wasted time figuring things out. Indiana, on the other hand, looked like a team that needed more things to go exactly right in order to feel fully dangerous. And remember, this wasn't some low-talent Fever group getting overwhelmed by a contender stacked with legends. Indiana has real firepower. Clark, Kelsey Mitchell, and Aaliyah Boston all made the All-Star game this season. That's not a roster lacking stars. That's a roster with enough high-end talent to scare anyone in the league when everything is clicking. Which is exactly why games like this feel so frustrating for Fever fans. Because when your core is that strong, losing is one thing. Looking controlled by the other team's identity is another. Golden State imposed itself. It dictated the kind of game this would be. It made Indiana work for every clean look, crowded the spaces Clark likes to operate in, and kept the Fever from ever feeling completely free. That defensive part cannot be overstated. Golden State has built one of the toughest defenses in the league. And it showed. The Valkyries came into that game with the best scoring defense in the WNBA, allowing a league-low number of points and holding teams to a low percentage from the field. They play physical without turning reckless, connected without looking rigid, and alert without overhelping themselves into trouble. Against a creator like Clark, that's huge. You can't just trap her blindly and hope for the best. She will burn that. You can't overreact to one action and leave shooters wide open. She will find that too. Nakase's team played like a group that had rehearsed every possibility. They mixed looks, stayed aware of secondary options, and forced Indiana into the kind of possession-by-possession grind that makes stars feel crowded. What made the result even more revealing was Nakase's post-game tone. She didn't act like the win meant everything had been perfect. She immediately pointed to the details she didn't like. Too many turnovers, not enough attention to the defensive game plan in the first half, spacing issues, execution issues, that's telling. A lot of coaches ride the emotion of a road win and save the critique for film later. Nakase was already there mentally. Her focus stayed on the standard, not the glow of the result. And players noticed that. It tells them that excellence is not something you claim after a win, it's something you chase regardless of what the scoreboard says. That mentality is a big reason Golden State feels like a team with staying power instead of a team on a lucky streak. But Indiana fans didn't experience that loss as just one more result in the standings. The reaction was stronger because the frustration had been simmering for weeks already. Long before Golden State came into town, the Fever had already triggered one of the loudest coaching controversies of the season. And once that earlier storm happened, everything afterwards started being viewed through that lens. The Portland game was where a lot of skepticism around Stephanie White went from background noise to full-blown online fire. Indiana lost 184, and the game itself was ugly enough. But what really blew everything up was a substitution stretch in the first quarter that viewers immediately latched onto. With around 6:30 left in the opening quarter, White pulled Caitlin Clark, Aaliyah Boston, and Lexi Hull. From there, Portland seized control and finished the quarter with a huge edge. Fans watching live didn't need a replay package to know what they felt. The team's rhythm disappeared, the energy dropped, and the decision became the main thing people talked about even before the final score was settled. White later explained that the substitution pattern was typical and noted that Boston was still managing her own minutes situation at the time. That explanation may have been completely honest, but it didn't calm the fan base at all. In fact, it may have done the opposite. Because once a fan base starts feeling like coaching choices are procedural instead of instinctive, phrases like typical pattern can sound cold. Supporters don't want to hear about routine when the game is swinging in real time. They want to believe the coach can feel the moment. So even if White was simply following a normal plan, the optics were brutal. And in a season where optics around this team were already fragile, brutal optics become gasoline. Then the sideline clip hit social media and everything got louder. The video appeared to show a tense moment between White and Clark before Clark headed out and another player checked in. Almost instantly, speculation exploded. Some fans claimed it proved the relationship between coach and star was breaking down. Others said the clip was being overread and that a competitive exchange in the middle of a frustrating game was being turned into a soap opera. Rumors flew in every direction because that's what happens when the biggest star in the league is involved. The truth is, those short clips rarely tell the whole story. They invite projection. They let people see whatever they already believe. Clark eventually pushed back hard on the narrative. She made it clear that people on television and online were flat out wrong about what they thought they were seeing, and she defended White publicly. White did the same, saying the moment ended right there and that people outside the building were creating a bigger story than actually existed. That matters, and it should be taken seriously. If the two people at the center of the moment are both saying the feud angle is overblown, viewers shouldn't pretend they know better from a compressed clip. But that still didn't erase the bigger issue. The problem wasn't only whether Clark and White were angry for 30 seconds. The problem was why so many people were so ready to believe something was off in the first place. That readiness came from accumulated doubt. By that point, fans had already seen injury report issues generate league attention earlier in the season. They had already seen minutes restrictions become headline material. They had already watched substitution choices spark confusion. So the sideline clip didn't create mistrust out of nowhere. It landed on top of mistrust that was already there. And once that happens, every ambiguous moment gets interpreted in the worst possible way by somebody. That is the environment Indiana has been living in. Clark can deny a feud, White can deny a feud, both can mean it completely. And still, the broader feeling of instability can survive because the team has not consistently looked clear enough to silence the speculation. That's what makes the Nakase comparison sting so much. Golden State has its own challenges, obviously. No team is perfect, but the Valkyries don't project that same fragility. Their messaging lines up with their style of play. Their style of play lines up with their roster construction. Their roster construction lines up with their coach's personality. Everything feels connected. Indiana may very well have a similarly coherent vision behind closed doors, but the public face of the team hasn't felt that way often enough. And in modern sports, public feeling matters more than organizations like to admit. You don't need the internet to be right for it to affect trust. You just need enough people to stop believing the coach is ahead of the moment. One of the most important differences between these two environments might come down to something very simple: accountability, not performative accountability, real accountability that players can feel. In the transcript you sent, one of the most telling moments was the description of Nakase calling a timeout, realizing a play she had wanted wasn't working, and immediately telling her player that the mistake was on her. That matters a lot. Players remember who protects them in those moments. They remember who owns a bad call instead of pretending everything flows downhill. And when a coach can say, "That one's on me," it changes the texture of the entire relationship. Corrections land differently. Trust grows faster. Effort becomes easier to sustain because players feel the standard applies to everybody, not just the people on the floor. Nakase talks about culture in a way that supports that. She has basically said you cannot inject unselfishness into people. You can't magically install character if it isn't already there. You can reward it, build around it, and insist on it, but you can't fake it. That mindset shows up in how Golden State built the roster. The Valkyries didn't just chase names, they chased temperament. They chased players who would celebrate each other, defend hard, accept changing roles, and make team success feel bigger than individual headlines. That's why their bench looks alive. That's why different lineups can still function. That's why a newer franchise can already look older than some teams that have been together longer. The front office and coaching staff seem aligned on the idea that talent alone is not enough. And that is where Indiana keeps looking vulnerable, at least from the outside. Again, this has to be said fairly: perception is not always reality. Clark has defended White. White has defended Clark. There may be much more internal unity than fans realize. But in professional sports, if the outside view consistently looks chaotic, that chaos starts affecting the conversation around everything you do. Every lineup tweak becomes suspicious. Every restriction feels like a referendum. Every loss looks like proof of something deeper. Golden State doesn't carry that burden right now. Indiana does. And that means White is coaching the team and the noise at the same time, which is a brutal job, but also part of the responsibility that comes with leading a player who moves the sport's entire media cycle. What makes Nakase so impressive is that she doesn't seem interested in coaching the noise. She coaches the habits. She keeps talking about the game underneath the game. Spacing, rotations, rebounding, defensive attention to detail, press break execution. Those things may sound boring to casual viewers, but they are exactly what give a team its identity when the pressure rises. And that's why Golden State feels sturdy. The Valkyries are not depending on emotional highs to survive. They have a framework, they know what they can lean on. Indiana has that kind of offensive ceiling when things click, but it hasn't always felt like the floor is equally stable. For a contender, that's dangerous. For a team built around the biggest star in women's basketball, it's even more dangerous because every wobble gets magnified. There's also something subtler happening in the public reaction to both coaches. Nakase has become easy to admire because her story and her team reinforce each other. She took the hard route, built a hard-nosed team, and now the results validate the message. White, meanwhile, is dealing with the opposite dynamic. Even when she makes a defensible decision, a chunk of the audience is ready to assume the worst because the team hasn't produced enough clean, confidence-building moments to reset perception. That doesn't mean the criticism is always fair. It means the context around her has become unforgiving. And when fans begin trusting the opposing coach's vision more than their own, that is a problem no stat sheet can hide. Bigger picture makes all of this impossible to dismiss as just internet drama. Golden State isn't merely having a fun little run. The Valkyries are building one of the most impressive early franchise arcs the league has seen. They reached 40 wins faster than any expansion team in WNBA history, which is absurd when you think about how new they are. They entered the Indiana game riding one of the longest active winning streaks in the league and came out of it with even more momentum. And through all of that, Nakase kept talking like someone who believes the team is still in the early stages of becoming what it can be. That's what separates a coach enjoying the moment from a coach building a serious program. She sees the current success, but she doesn't let the team live inside it. That 5-year plan Golden State has discussed feels different now too. At first it sounded like the normal language every expansion franchise uses to calm expectations. Build carefully, grow over time, don't rush it. But because the Valkyries accelerated so quickly, the plan now sounds less like a shield and more like a warning. If this is what the team looks like while still supposedly climbing toward its true peak, then the rest of the league has a problem. And that's why Nakase's comments after wins matter so much. She doesn't sound surprised by progress. She sounds hungry for precision. She sounds like somebody who expected growth and now wants to harden it into championship habits. Meanwhile, Caitlin Clark continues to do things that should make Indiana one of the most terrifying teams in the sport. She has already put together statistical territory no one in league history has reached, combining elite scoring and elite playmaking in a way that changes how teams defend the entire floor. She warps spacing. She speeds up help decisions. She turns ordinary shooters into dangerous weapons if you blink at the wrong time. Add Kelsey Mitchell's scoring and Aaliyah Boston's interior stability, and on paper this should be one of the league's cleanest high-end trios. That is what makes the Fever conversation so maddening. The ingredients are there. The flashes are there. The blowout of Las Vegas proved how explosive the ceiling can be. And still, somehow, the weekly conversation keeps sliding back toward management instead of dominance. For fans, that creates emotional whiplash. One night, Indiana looks like a group that can run anyone out of the gym. The next night, the entire discussion is about whether Clark's minutes made sense, whether a substitution killed momentum, whether the bench was used right, whether the offense looked free enough, whether the coach is getting too cute, whether the team is overthinking itself. That is exhausting, especially because the potential is so obvious. And every time Golden State shows up looking composed, that frustration gets sharper. The Valkyries are basically a mirror showing Indiana exactly what alignment looks like. Same league, same pressure, same need to make hard choices, totally different emotional atmosphere. So where does that leave Clark? In a fascinating and uncomfortable place. She still has every reason to believe in what Indiana can become. She has real talent around her. She has a coach with genuine experience and success. She has a fan base that cares deeply, sometimes too loudly but undeniably deeply. And she is still young enough that every tough stretch can become part of the growth story later. At the same time, she is dealing with a level of scrutiny that almost no player has ever faced. Every injury update becomes national conversation. Every missed shot gets clipped. Every visible frustration becomes a theory. Every coaching decision around her becomes bigger than it would be for almost anyone else in the league. That can sharpen a player, but it can also cloud everything around them if the environment isn't steady enough. That's why this isn't just a who's the better coach conversation. Reducing it to that would be lazy. White's resume is real. Clark's support for White has been real too. So any honest reading has to leave room for the idea that some of the outside noise is exactly that, noise. But being fair doesn't mean pretending the contrast isn't visible. It is visible. Nakase has an expansion team playing with clarity, toughness, and trust. White has a star-loaded roster that keeps circling back to the same public questions about rhythm, direction, and management. Those two truths can exist at the same time. And when they do, fans are going to compare. Maybe the most interesting question isn't whether Clark is being held back in some dramatic sense. Maybe it's whether she is still only showing a fraction of how dangerous she can be once the environment around her feels cleaner. What happens when the injuries calm down, the restrictions disappear, the rotations settle, and the team stops turning every week into a debate? What happens if Indiana actually reaches the point where the biggest story is just how impossible Clark is to guard rather than how complicated her situation feels? That version of the Fever is still out there as a possibility. And if it ever fully arrives, the league is going to feel it immediately. But right now, the comparison to Natalie Nakase and the Valkyries is unavoidable because Golden State looks like what coherence feels like. It looks like what trust looks like. It looks like what happens when coaching, roster construction, and identity all point in the same direction. That doesn't mean Golden State will win the title. It doesn't mean Indiana is doomed. It means one team is making its talent easier to believe in, while the other is still asking fans for patience they're no longer eager to give. And when Caitlin Clark is the face of that tension, the conversation is never going to stay quiet. So maybe that's the thought to leave this with. Natalie Nakase may not just be winning games, she may be exposing how powerful a fully connected basketball environment can be. And Caitlin Clark may not just be surviving a rough stretch. She may be showing everyone how much force it takes to keep shining when the setup around you still feels a little unfinished. That is why these matchups land harder than ordinary regular season games. They don't just give us a result, they give us a comparison. One sideline looks settled, the other still feels debated. One team looks like it knows exactly who it is. The other looks like it's still trying to become that in public. And until that changes, every time Nakase outmaneuvers Indiana, fans are going to ask the same question all over again. Is Caitlin Clark simply facing great defense, or is she also fighting a situation that still hasn't caught up to her talent?